So I got this note from Phyllis, who wanted to ask a question about something that Dan Ariely's doing. So I figured I'd answer her. What Dan wants to do is Dan wants to have a salary experiment inside an organization. He doesn't think that we're motivated by salaries the way that we think we are. The only way you can find out, run an experiment. Well, it turns out that's kind of hard. And the reason why is that who wants to run an experiment inside your company about salary? You know, salary's the big thing that we all worry about. Well, it turns out that there's somebody who's done it. So Dan Ariely doesn't actually have to run the experiment. Well, he became a lord later on in life, but back then his name was Wilfred Brown. He ran these experiments in the 50s and 60s. And he's a really kind of interesting guy. And I think it's time for you to learn something about him. So this Wilfred Brown guy, he ran a company called Glacier Metal. And it's through a kind of a series of really tragic events that he became CEO at a really young age. He was only about 29 when he became CEO and chairman. He was 31. So really young. And although his family was, well, I mean, they weren't, lower class or anything, but they also weren't aristocrats. He married into the family that owned Glacier Metal, or at least were primary shareholders. And as a result, when that tragic event, his wife died, I think she died in childbirth, his father-in-law died, and his mother-in-law all died within like a year and a half, 2 years of each other. That left him not only widowed, but he was also somebody who got stuck running the company. If you're Wilfred Brown, that could be kind of interesting. So it turns out that Wilfred had some things going for him. The first thing is that he wasn't really all that educated. He'd had to skip university because times being what they were, he needed to go out and earn some money. And he also wasn't particularly an aristocrat, right? So he didn't have that. That's kind of something that's going to go for him later on. Now, he becomes an aristocrat. He becomes a lord. But that's later on. He joins the House of Lords, joins the labor government. One of the other things that makes him really fascinating is that he was always a person who was really big on workers' rights. He's a CEO. He was also a lifelong socialist and a big-time pro-unionizer. Odd for a CEO. So still talking about Brown here. So Brown's kind of a leftist, but he's also somebody who's really curious. And one of the things he was really curious about were things that most of the rest of us aren't. Things that we just take for granted, like social arrangements, things like salary. Wilfred Brown wanted to know, why do we get paid what we do? So Brown wanted to ask this really important question. Why should he get paid more than anybody else? Now, normal CEOs don't care about that. They just care about getting paid. Wilfred Brown wasn't a normal CEO. And he did care about how much people got paid. And he cared about why they got paid that. And the answer is really pretty problematic. Even asking the question is problematic. The first answer most people give is, well, it's education. That can't be true because Wilfred Brown wasn't as educated as most of the people who were in his engineering staff. He had never gone to university. And even the universities he was later affiliated with weren't Cambridge, they weren't Oxford, they weren't anything fancy. So Wilfred Brown's education was a lot lower, and yet he got paid more. Because he was CEO, it kind of makes sense, but it's not education. It's got to be something else. All right, so let's say the next thing that everyone always says, which is, well, it's because of how hard you work. That hard work earns you more money. Within a particular field, that's kind of true. It's called piecework down at the bottom. If you are somebody who is working, on the line, especially back then, you got paid by how many widgets you produced. So if you produced more widgets, you got paid more money. That does make sense. But it falls apart when you go across the boundaries, departmental boundaries. They're within the same company. You've got people in engineering who are obviously earning a lot more money than someone who's on the line, but they aren't working nearly as hard. Look, line guys will often work overtime. Most of the time that overtime's forced. They can work pretty darn hard. Engineering guys sometimes, got in at 9, left at 6. They even took an hour lunch. They weren't working that hard. Now, that's not true of everybody, and there are certainly some engineers who worked really hard, but there are a lot of guys who, look, their families were wealthy, they went to university, they got an engineering degree, they're competent. There's no problem. You're paying the engineers more. It's not about how hard you work, or at least it's not all about how hard you work. Got to be something different. This is what kept Wilfred Brown busy for like a decade. Now, Wilfred Brown actually came up with something. And I'm going to give you the answer that Wilfred Brown discovered. And it's going to be something that's going to so challenge all of your unexamined ideas about salary, about what motivates people, about maybe what motivates you. You're not going to believe me. I can say that because no manager ever believes me at first. Even when I show them all the evidence, they still don't believe me. And the evidence is actually pretty big. Wilfred Brown ran these studies from the 50s into the 60s. He started paying people, according to this idea that I'm going to tell you, probably in the mid-50s. So he had a decade, and it was really weird because it was a really calm decade for him, even though everybody else in Britain was having a lot of unrest. So you might want to pay attention to this. It's going to be a big idea. Brown had this killer discovery. It was really discovered while he was there. He wasn't discovered by him. It was actually discovered kind of by the guys on just managers who are working there. And although this truck's really loud, it's going to be a big discovery. You'll probably want to have some quiet. What they discovered was that there's a way to pay people that everyone thought was fair. And oddly enough, they call it felt fair pay. Once they arranged it, and they figured out what was fair for the jobs that people were doing, people didn't mind their salary. Not only that, they stopped mucking around with trying to figure out who got paid more, because they kind of already knew. They also just got down to the work. Yeah, that's right. They stopped talking about salary and how much they got paid. They actually did something. When's the last time that happened at your company? Well, you can do what you're going to want to do. And I'm just telling you that if you reject this, you're rejecting it because you have your own set of unexamined, prejudged, frankly, built on nothing ideas about salary, pay, and compensation. When you actually look at it, and if you had the stones enough to actually run the experiment, you'd see that people can actually be paid in a way that they stop talking about salary. Look, one of the reasons why nobody wants this is that the people who do compensation, they get paid a lot of money to do, frankly, absolutely nothing. At least nothing of value. You got a bunch of CEOs who sit there. They can't measure the value of work that they're doing. They can't measure the type of work that they're doing. And so they just get paid based upon what other CEOs make. But what's a CEO? If you think about it, there's lots of people who are CEOs. But most CEOs actually get their pay based upon other CEOs' pay in companies that are kind of the same size. It's all voodoo. Nobody wants to correct it. But they can, and Wilfred Brown ran the experiments. He examined what salary was, he discovered it, and he led an entire company based on the results. If you're interested, you can read more in this book. He wrote several. The one I'd recommend, it's got an easy title. It's called Organization. There's your question, Phyllis. You can actually know what to pay people, how to pay them, and what to do with them, all based upon some information and experiments that were actually done in real companies based upon real salaries. Take a look.